Hi everyone, and welcome to the first in our series of 4 technical webinars. Today we're going to be looking at TNPs and breaks in learning, and this session is primarily for training providers and employer providers, but other employers may find this useful as well. My name's Nick Duff from the Service Engagement team within the Apprenticeship Service, and I'll be hosting today's session. So because we're going to cover a lot of ground today, you may want to refer back to the content after the session, we're going to give you access to a copy of the slides, and I'll tell you how you can access them at the end of the session. We're also recording today's webinar, so you'll be able to access a recording on both our webinar platform and also on YouTube. And again, I'll tell you how you can access those recordings towards the end of the session, so that either you can refer back to them as you want, or you can get colleagues to listen in as well if they need to. I'm joined by a few colleagues today to actually deliver our session. We've got Sean Farlow and Henry Morgan, who are application support specialists in the Apprenticeship Service. And we've also got 3 more colleagues that we can call upon during the QA session. They are Sam Miller, who's our Senior Business Solutions Lead on the Apprenticeship Service. We've also got Niall Geraghty, who's an Operations Manager on the Apprenticeship Service. And then finally, we've got Duncan Wannell, who's our in-year calculations Senior Manager. So big welcome to all of you. Today's session is going to last around 60 minutes, and we've got a questions and answer session included within that. So Sean will be running you through the TNP and breaks in learning and the scenarios that you might encounter. He'll also be giving you some hints and tips based on typical user behaviour that we've observed within the service. Then Henry's going to go through some of the most interesting questions and answers that we picked out from last year's webinar, and we think that they're worth reiterating this time round as well for you to have some more information. As usual, we won't go through questions in our Q&A session that don't relate to today's topic or that are specific to your individual account. For these types of questions, we'd suggest that you contact the support desk, and again, I'll be giving you their details towards the end of the webinar. We'll obviously try and get through as many of the questions as possible, theming them as well, so that the panel don't have to answer the same sorts of questions over and again. But if we don't manage to cover everything, we do commit to take away those questions that haven't been answered, and we'll get a response to you for those questions, and we'll send them out to everybody that attended today in about 4 or 5 weeks' time. Okay, so to take us through our main input today, we have Sean and Henry. So Sean, I think you're up first, so I think I'm handing over to you. Are you there?
Thanks, Nick. Good afternoon, all. So to start us off, I just wanted to start off with something that hopefully we're all familiar with, and this is just a refresher, but just to start off looking at TNP records. Next slide, please. So TNP records, or total negotiated price records, are essentially used to declare the financial information relating to the apprenticeship in your ILR. A TNP1 is used to record the total cost of training that is applicable to the whole apprenticeship from the very start with a training provider. And a TNP2 is used to record the total cost of assessment that's applicable to that whole apprenticeship from the very start. So typically when a learner's first added to an ILR, a TNP1 and TNP2 are recorded with the costs for the entire apprenticeship. And the only time you ever need to adjust those costs and record further TNP1 and TNP2 records is if either the cost of training or the cost of assessment for that whole apprenticeship has been renegotiated or needs to change. The dates that you record on the TNP1 and TNP2 records are simply the dates that those prices were agreed. And those dates must fall within the current funding year. So we're currently in the 22-23 funding year, which runs from the 1st of August 2022 to the 31st of July 2023. So any TNP1 and TNP2 records that you add must be dated between those dates. Next slide, please. A TNP3 and TNP4 record are slightly different to the TNP1 and TNP2, and these are used for declaring the residual or remaining training and assessment costs for an apprenticeship as at a given point in time. So one occasion where you would normally use a TNP3 and TNP4 is where there's been a change of employer and you need to record what the remaining cost is that's been agreed between yourself as the provider and that new employer. This isn't the only time that you'd need to use a TNP3 and TNP4, and we'll have a look a little later on at when that might be. Next slide, please. I just wanted to add, when talking about TNP records, there's a couple of golden rules that we advise, and if you stick to this, you'll help to avoid unnecessary DLOC 7s. And the first one is never modify any TNP records that are dated in a previous funding year. And the second one is when adding new records, they must always be dated in the current funding year. And just to reiterate, a funding year runs from the 1st of August through to the 31st of July. And if you do break any of those records, you will cause yourself an unnecessary DLOC 7. Next slide, please. Okay, so in this next section, I just want to look at how we accurately record a break in learning within your ILR and the different scenarios that you may encounter when an apprentice is returning from a break in learning. Next slide, please. So to start off with, I just wanted to explain the difference between a break in learning and a withdrawal, and also to talk about the employer's records on the apprenticeship service being paused and stopped. So a break in learning is where an apprentice takes an agreed break from learning with a training provider with the intention that they will at some point return to learning with that same provider and continue their apprenticeship. And an example of that could be something like maternity leave. A withdrawal, on the other hand, is where an apprentice has withdrawn from training with a provider and has no intention of continuing the apprenticeship with that provider. Although, as we do see sometimes, they do return after a withdrawal has been recorded, and we'll have a little look at that a little later. On the apprenticeship service, employers' records can either be set to paused or stopped. And the main difference between those is that a paused record can be resumed and made live again, whereas a stopped record can't. That is irreversible. And so for a break in learning, we would typically see that the employer's record would be paused. And then when they return from that break in learning, that employer's record would be resumed again. And when an apprentice is withdrawn in the ILR, we would typically see the employer's record would be stopped as they're not intending to return. It's worth adding probably at this point that earnings and payments that are made to training providers are driven entirely from the ILR. So recording a break in learning or a withdrawal in the ILR would stop earnings from being generated and therefore would stop payments being made. And that's irrespective of what the employer does with the record on the apprenticeship service, really. The pausing or stopping of the records on the apprenticeship service is effectively the employer's means of stopping payments being made to a training provider. And this is essentially in case a learner goes on a break in learning or a withdrawal and the provider doesn't record that in the ILR or records it late. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide simply shows an apprentice who is recorded as live or in learning in the ILR. So on the left, we've got the ILR learning aim with the start date 15th of September 21, the planned end date 11th of December 23, the course code is 157, and the completion status is set to 1, which is continuing in learning. We've got a set of TNP records there, which are declaring the cost for the whole apprenticeship with this provider, which is £7,000. There hasn't been a change of employer, and we know that because there's not a TNP3 and TNP4 present. And over on the right, we've just got an example of the Apprenticeship Service record for this apprentice, which is showing the status of live. And in this situation, we would be generating monthly on-program earnings, and these would be being paid to the provider. Next slide, please. So this slide shows how we would record a learner as going on a break in learning. And the way you record this is the same whether there has been a change of employer before the apprentice takes that break in learning or not. So on the left, we've got the ILR, and effectively what we do is we close that learning aim. So the learning actual end date is entered, the 3rd of May 23. The completion status is either set to 6 for a withdrawal due to a break in learning, or 3 for a complete withdrawal, and the outcome is set to 3 for no achievement. And I mentioned previously that earnings and payments are driven entirely from the ILR, which means that by recording the learner as being on a break in learning in the ILR, that would stop earnings being generated and therefore would stop payments being made. And over on the right, we can see that employer has paused the record on the apprenticeship service. And again, as I mentioned previously, this is just their kind of backstop in case the provider doesn't record that break in learning. And in that instance, if the employer has recorded that pause and the provider hasn't recorded that break in learning, then that would trigger a DLOC 12 for the training provider because we can't pay those earnings. Next slide, please. Okay, so we'll now have a look at 4 scenarios where we record an apprentice as going on a break in learning and then they return from that break in learning. But each one is slightly different in terms of whether or not there has been a change of employer and whether that change of employer is before or after the break in learning. And these different scenarios essentially mean that when you record the apprentice as returning, you have to record the TNP record slightly different depending on which one of those 4 scenarios it is. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first scenario is how we would record a learner as returning from a break in learning with the original employer. So there is no change of employer before or as part of this return from the break. So over on the left, we have the original learning aim that we previously closed. And we can see in this learning aim that there wasn't a change of employer, as I say, because there's no TNP3 and TNP4 there. So what we do is we leave that original learning aim untouched and we open a new learning aim, and this is the one that we can see on the right. So we record the new learning start date, the 8th of July 23. We record the original learning start date, which was the 15th of September 21. We record the new planned end date, and we do tend to see that this is pushed back a little bit due to that break in learning. The completion status in this new learning aim goes back to a 1 to signify that they're in learning, and we record the restart indicator. In terms of TNP records for this scenario, we simply record a TNP1 and TNP2 in the new learning aim with the same costs that were on the original records. We just date them with the new learning start date. And if you remember from earlier, I said that a TNP1 and a TNP2 are for recording the cost for the entire apprenticeship, which is what we're doing here. And it's worth kind of saying here that just because there's been a break in learning, the cost for that entire apprenticeship hasn't changed. We do see in this scenario that some providers try to record the remaining costs in a TNP3 and TNP4 record, or sometimes they record those remaining costs in a TNP1 and TNP2. As I say, for this scenario, there's no need to record any remaining costs. We just redeclare the original costs for the entire apprenticeship. Effectively, our system knows what was earned prior to that break in learning, and therefore knows what is remaining now that the learner has returned. So that's kind of taken care of by our service. And if we think about the employer's records on the apprenticeship service that I mentioned, the new learning aim in the ILR would match to that same employer's record on the apprenticeship service now that the learning aim, that the original learning aim matched to. Effectively, the course is the same, the costs are the same, etc. This would now mean that earnings start to be generated again. We would expect that employer to resume the record that they previously paused on the apprenticeship service. Next slide, please. Okay, so scenario 2. So this one shows how we would record a learner as returning from a break in learning, where up to the point they went on that break in learning, there hadn't been a change of employer. So there's no TNP 3 and 4 in the original learning aim, but now they are returning with a new employer. So as before, we leave the original closed learning aim untouched, and again we open a new learning aim, and this is the one shown on the right. Again, as before, we record the new learning start date, the original learning start date, the new planned end date, and again the completion status in this new learning aim goes back to a 1, and as before we record the restart indicator. And in terms of TNP records, this time we must record the remaining costs that have been agreed with that new employer at the point the apprentice changed employer. So rather than record a TNP1 and TNP2, as we did for that first scenario, we would record a TNP3 and a TNP4. So as you can see in this example, the residual cost of training is £800 and the residual cost of assessment is £1,000. And again, if we think about the records on the apprenticeship service for a second, to coincide with the return from that break in learning with a new employer, then a new record would need to be in place on the apprenticeship service for that new employer with the correct remaining cost. And as long as that new employer's record is in place before the ILR is submitted with the TNP3 and TNP4, then everything's fine. It's worth adding that if the ILR is submitted before that new employer's record is in place, then the new learning aim would actually match to the first employer's record, and the TNP3 and TNP4 costs doesn't match that first employer's record, and that would cause an unnecessary DLOC 7. So it's worth me saying there that to always ensure that the new employer's record is in place on the service before recording that change of employer in the ILR. Next slide, please. Okay, so the third scenario is where there has been a change of employer prior to the learner going on a break in learning, and the learner is now returning with a third new employer. So for this apprenticeship, we know that the apprentice started the apprenticeship with one employer in September 2021 with an agreed cost for the whole apprenticeship of £7,000. And we can see there that this is declared in the TNP1 and TNP2 records. There was then a change of employer in June 22, and the cost at that time was agreed with the second employer at £5,000 because this is declared in the TNP3 and TNP4 records. The apprentice then went on the break in learning in May 23, so the learning aim on the left was closed. The apprentice is now returning with a third employer on the 8th of July 23. So this is effectively the same as scenario 2 in that we agree a price with that third employer and record that price in the new learning aim on the right in TNP3 and TNP4 records. And in terms of the records on the apprenticeship service, there would be 3 employer records, 1 for each employer. The TNP1 and TNP2 for the first would match the first, in the first learning aim would match that first employer's record. The TNP3 and TNP4 in that first learning aim, which is £5,000, would match to the second employer's record. And now the third TNP3 and TNP4 on the right for 1,800 would match to that third employer's record. Next slide, please. So this slide shows scenario 4, and this is where there has been a change of employer prior to the learner going on the break in learning, but this time the learner is returning to learning with that same second employer. And the question that often comes up in this scenario is, what costs do we record on the TNP3 and TNP4 in that new learning aim? And if you think about the records on the Apprenticeship Service for a second, we've got one employer's record from when the apprenticeship first started in September 21 with a cost of £7,000. We've then got another employer's record for that change of employer in June 22 with a cost of £5,000. And the apprentice is now returning with that same second employer. So it's subtly different to the previous one. The easiest way to deal with this is to take the TNP3 and TNP4 costs that are in the original learning aim from the change of employer on the 12th of June, the £5,000 effectively, and re-add those same costs for when the learner returns from the break in learning in July 23. So this effectively means that the TNP3 and TNP4 in the first learning aim and the TNP3 and TNP4 in the new learning aim both match to that second employer's record on the Apprenticeship Service, which is correct. However, we know that a TNP3 and TNP4 are for recording the remaining costs as at a given point in time. And what we're effectively saying here in our ILR is that the remaining cost on the 12th of June, at the point the learner changed employer, was £5,000. And then we're saying that the same £5,000 is the remaining cost on the 8th of July when the learner is returning from the break in learning. And if we think about that, we know that can't strictly be true because there would have been earnings and payments between the 12th of June 22 when the apprentice changed employer and the 3rd of May 23 when the learner went on the break in learning. And because of this, it would mean that your indicative earnings report would inform you that you're over the funding band maximum. And this is essentially because when you take the earnings to date, i.e. everything in the first learning aim prior to that break in learning for both employers, and you add that to the value that you're now declaring is the remaining cost in July 23, it would take you over the funding band maximum. The indicative earnings report is essentially an informational report, and as long as you understand that the reason the report is informing you that you're over the funding band maximum, then there's nothing wrong with doing this. One last thing worth saying on this really is that a simple rule here, and that is once you've declared a TNP3 and TNP4 in your ILR, then any further TNP records must also be TNP3 and TNP4s. Next slide. Okay, just to continue on scenario for you really. So use the TNP3 and TNP4 costs that are on the original learning aim from the change of employer on the 12th of June, the 5,000, and re-add those same costs for when the learner returns from that break in learning. And as I said, your indicative earnings report will inform you that you're over the funding band maximum. But as long as you understand why that is, and this only applies to this scenario 4, then there's nothing wrong with doing that. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so just moving on, I wanted just to cover something that I mentioned earlier. And it's kind of around how we handle things that don't quite go to plan or unexpected things happen. And I mentioned earlier that when a learner is recorded as going on a break in learning, we would typically hope to see that the employer's apprenticeship service would be paused and then resumed. But what do we do if the employer's record is stopped? We can't make that stopped record live again, so what do we do? So there's two ways of resolving this on the apprenticeship service, and it depends on whether the employer is a levy paying employer or not. And then depending on how this is resolved on the apprenticeship service, then determines how we need to record things in the ILR. And this therefore means it's important that providers and employers communicate and discuss things like this to ensure that kind of both parties are singing from the same hymn sheet. Okay, next slide, please. So let's say our apprentice went on a break in learning in May 23 with the intention of returning, but the apprenticeship service record has been stopped in error. So at the top of this slide, we can see the original apprenticeship service record with the start date of September 21, the cost of £7,000, and we can see that the record has been stopped with a date of May 23. The apprentice is now returning on the 8th of July 23. So the first option on how to resolve this is to effectively create a new commitment or a new apprenticeship service record with exactly the same details as that record that's been stopped. Now, only levy paying employers can actually do this option, and that's because they're able to create new commitments with a start date in the past. Okay, so this option isn't available for non-levy employers because they're not able to create reservations and commitments with a date that's in the past. We'll have a look at that on the next slide. So what we'd do is the original record would be stopped back to the start, and by that we mean setting the stop date that is equal to the start date, and then we would create a new record with exactly the same start date, end date and costs as the stopped record. And we can see that in the middle panel, the stop date's been put back to September 21 and the new record has been created with exactly the same dates and costs, etc. So in terms of the ILR for this option, we can record this in exactly the same way as we've recorded the return from a break in learning with that same employer, which was scenario 1. So we would take the TNP records, the TNP1 and the TNP2 records from the original learning aim and use those same costs in the new learning aim with the new start date. And if we think about that for a second, the first learning aim before a break in learning, the one on the left, would match to the original AS record. The new learning aim on the right will now match to the newly created record, which is effectively a copy of the original one. Both got the cost of £7,000. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so let's have a look at the other option. So this option is also available to levy employers, and this is the only option that's available to non-levy, and that is to create a new record from the point the learner returns. So here we would leave the stop date on the original record as it is, May 23, and we would create a new record from July 23 when the learner's returning with the remaining cost that is left on that apprenticeship. And in this example, the remaining cost is 1,800. This can be seen on the middle panel there. And in terms of the ILR for this option, we would record this in the same way that we recorded the return from the break in learning with a new employer, which was scenario 2 earlier. So in terms of the ILR, we will record a TNP3 and a TNP4 dated July 23 with the cost of 1,800. And the important thing to remember there is that a TNP3 or 4 are for recording the remaining cost as a given point in time, and that's effectively what we're doing here. We're saying that the remaining cost as at July 23 is 1,800. And again, looking at the two learning aims, the first learning aim before that break in learning would have matched to the original Apprenticeship Service record for £7,000, and the new learning aim will now match to the newly created record. Next slide, please. And just one last slide on this. And I wanted to include this one really because it is something we see providers doing wrong from time to time. We've already seen how we record a break in learning order withdrawal by closing one learning aim, and then if the apprentice returns, we open a new learning aim. And both of those learning aims should be recorded in the ILR for the lifetime of that apprenticeship. We do see situations where a learning aim has been closed with a withdrawal and it's returned in the ILR up to R14 of that year, which is correct. And then from the start of the next funding year, i.e. from August, the learner isn't in the provider's ILR, which again is fine. But what we see sometimes then is some considerable time later, and that could be 12 months, 18 months later, the learner reappears in the ILR on that same apprenticeship, but it's coded in the ILR as though it's a brand new start, and only that new learning aim is returned. The original learning aim is lost. And I'm not sure how your third-party MI systems work. Maybe if the first learning aim might be archived off at some point. But as I say, all learning aims for the entire apprenticeship with that provider should always be returned in the ILR. Effectively, an apprentice can only ever start an apprenticeship once. So if they take a break in learning or are withdrawn, then when they return, even if it is 18 months later, this is always a restart. It should never be recorded as a new start, and both learning aims should always be returned. And if we look at the two learning aims, the one on the left has been recorded as a withdrawal, and the one on the right has been coded as though it is a new start. So there's no restart indicator, which should be there, and it's been coded as a TNP1 and TNP2, and again, which have got the remaining costs of 1,800. In terms of earnings, whatever was earned in that first learning aim 18 months ago is deducted from what you have recorded now in this TNP1 and TNP2 in the new learning aim. So let's say £1,500 was earned in that first learning aim prior to the withdrawal or the break in learning, then that would be effectively be deducted from the 1,800 that you are now recording as a brand new start in the new learning aim, which effectively means that you can only earn £300. So let's say the 1,500, sorry about that. So as per the previous slide, the correct way this should be recorded would be either TNP1 and TNP2 totaling 7,000, or the 1,800 should be in a TNP3 and TNP4, and as I say, both learning aims should be returned. Next slide, please. Okay, so to finish off, I'll hand you over to Henry to just run through a few questions and answers that we picked up out of the webinar that we presented last year around TNP records and breaks in learning. So over to you, Henry.
Okay, hello everyone, and Thank you. Yeah, so I will launch into it. First question we have here is, when a learner with a TNP 3 and 4, so there's already been a change of employer, goes on a breaking learning, does the restart continue with a TNP 3 and 4? And the answer is yes, always. Once you have a TNP 3 and 4 in the ILR, then any future pricing records must also be a TNP 3 and 4, as shown in scenarios 3 and 4 of the slides we've just been through. Scenario 3 is a learner who has a TNP 3 and 4 and the restart is with a new employer. Scenario 4 is a learner who has a TNP 3 and 4 and the restart is with the same employer. Next, moving on to the next one. If a learner restarts, if a learner withdraws, not a break in learning from an apprenticeship, and then later returns to the same employer, should we record the full value of the apprenticeship in TNP 1 and 2 and not the value remaining? If the employer's record on the Apprenticeship Service has not been stopped, i.e. is still live, or has only been paused and can therefore be resumed, then we can take the TNP records from the previous learning aim and use those in the new learning aim. This could be a TNP 1 and 2 if they're returning with the original employer, refer to scenario 1 of the slides we've been through, or it could be a 3 and 4 if there was a change of employer prior to the withdrawal, refer to scenario 4. If the employer's record has been stopped, then you would have to refer to the guidance we gave in, I can't make a stopped record live again, what do I do, in that section of these slides you've just been through. If I could have the next slide, please. Okay, the next question is, what if the apprentice restarts with a new provider? Does the new provider record as TNP 1 and 2 or TNP 3 and 4? When the apprentice starts with a new provider, i.e. the provider is adding the apprentice into their MI system for the first time, then a TNP 1 and 2 should always be used. The next question, if a learner returns to learning following a withdrawal but returns with a different employer, do we record the amounts as TNP 3 and TNP 4? Yes, always. TNP 3 and TNP 4, refer to scenarios 2 and 3 in the earlier slides. The next slide, please. And I think this is the last one. If the TNP 1 and 2 are added incorrectly, how should you correct this? E.g., TNP 1 was added as 1,000 and TNP 2 was added as 1,000. We later find out the training price is incorrect. The EPA price is fine, but how is the correction made? The record with the incorrect price should not be amended. A new TNP1 record should be added with a date that falls in the current funding year and the new cost. Bear in mind that this change of price, this will not now match to the price in the Apprenticeship Service and would trigger a DLOC 7, which you would need to triage on your side of the Apprenticeship Service, pass over to the employer for them to accept. Excuse me. The next question. Do you have to add both TNP 1 and 2 again when the EPA cost reduces, even though the TNP 1 remains the same? No, you can just add a new TNP 2. The cost of the previous TNP 1 will be added to the cost of the new TNP 2 to give a new overall cost for the whole apprenticeship. Okay, and the last question, which for some reason, just bear with me just a moment. Okay, should the TNP2 be the EPA cost or the 20% of the agreed cost? TNP2 and perhaps TNP4 should be the cost of endpoint assessment. The 20% completion payment that you're paid is not explicitly recorded by you in the ILR. We calculate it. And that's the end of the Q&A from the previous webinar.
Okay, listen, Sean, Henry, thanks very much for going through that. The level of detail and the amount that you've covered in that has been amazing. So well done, guys. Obviously, you'll expect that that's triggered loads of questions, and thank you everybody for submitting the questions. I just wanted to go through one point that came up quite early on. Sean, when you mentioned, I think you were going through the costs of the entire apprenticeship slide, and you mentioned that we're in 22-23, but there's a point there that we're in 23-24 training year now, funding year now. Is there any comment on that from either you or Henry?
Well, I can comment on that. We're in both, technically, in terms of ILR returns, because obviously the R13 and R14 are open for 22-23, and obviously the 23-24 year has started. I think it's worth saying that there isn't any change to any of this guidance moving between academic years. So if people are concerned about that, then I think we can cover that off, that the guidance applies to both academic years.
Cool, thanks, Henry. That's useful clarification. Okay, so next question then. This one for you, Henry, if you don't mind. So if you've got an existing TNP 3 and 4 on your ILR and you need to change the breakdown of the 3 and 4 prices, but the overall cost stays the same, do you enter a new one, or do you just overtype the existing prices?
In that scenario, I would always suggest adding a new one.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be what.
And then Sean, a couple for you if I can. If the apprentice changes employer and the training price changes, but the EPA price doesn't, so that's the endpoint assessment price doesn't, does the EPA price still need to be added even though it's still the same, or would a TNP4 be needed?
Yeah, so a TNP3 record is for the cost of the training. A TNP4 is for the cost of assessment. And remember what I said about a TNP3 and 4, they are for recording a price at a particular point in time. So essentially, if you're recording a TNP3 and 4, let's say with the date of April, and you need to adjust those, and you're kind of 3 months down the line, you are now declaring the cost, what the remaining cost is 3 months down the line, not what the cost was in April, if that makes sense. Okay.
So the next question I've got for you, Sean, is that there's been an increase. If there's been an increase in the price for a TNP2, the new price has not always been pushed from the ILR into the Apprenticeship Service. It says the provider saying if they're happy to take the hit in costs, would we need to change the TNP2 as it would be an underclaim rather than overclaim? Is that what we have to show in our records?
So, as I say, a TNP1 is for recording the cost of training, a TNP2 is for recording the cost of assessment, and essentially the two added together equals the sum that's been agreed with the employer. If you need to change one of them, so let's say the cost of the EPA changes, then you just need to record a new TNP2, leave the original one as is, record a new TNP2. Remember that the date has to be in the current funding year. That new TNP2 cost is then added to the original TNP1 cost to give a new cost. So if you're just going to change the TNP2, then essentially you are adjusting that combined cost. If you're kind of just reapportioning it, so a lot of time we kind of see providers who will record, let's say, £18,000 in a TNP1 and then split it out. So essentially going forward, then you would need to record a new TNP1 and 2, reducing the cost on the TNP1 and putting the cost on the TNP2, the assessment. And as long as that overall equals what was in the TNP1 originally, then you're not going to kind of get any DLOC 7 because there's no change in cost.
Okay, cool. Henry, got a few questions for you. I'm not sure which bit this relates to. It says there's a question that's asking, does the employer have to pause for a break or can they leave the record live?
So yeah, it's a good question worth asking. The pause in the apprenticeship service is not mandatory for a break in learning. It gives the employer reassurance that the provider isn't taking money from them, that provider may not be due, but it isn't mandatory. If the ILR is accurate, then the provider won't be paid what they're due, or if the ILR is made accurate, the provider won't be paid more than they're due.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then I've got another question. When a learner's on a break, but the employer doesn't pause,
It's the same. It's the same. It's the
is
same
it the same
question.
question? Okay.
Apologies, I assigned myself on that one as well.
Fair. I'll move on then, and we'll do then the. Are there any accommodations for when an employer stops a record in error?
Well, we went through some scenarios with regards to that in relation to break in learning. That was some of the later slides, how that could be accommodated. In terms, it is possible for an employer to edit a stop date at least once. The functionality is in the system to edit the stop date, but there isn't a way of removing a stop date. It's a fine, and there are various warnings in the service to the employer to prompt them, do you really want to make this stop? Do you really want to apply this stop date? Those have been added in the last couple of years. But yeah, that's the answer I would give to that one.
Okay, and then Sean, for you, there's a question about, so there's a question saying there's lots of cases where employers take a while to pause the learner on the apprenticeship service, and then they're unable to be backdated to the correct month. In these cases, is it worth just telling the employer to leave the cohort as live?
So I think this is one that we touched on earlier, and probably Henry's answered a little bit here. So essentially, the pause and stop is the employer's kind of control. If an employer pauses a record for a break in learning, then obviously if the learner returns from a break in learning, that pause needs to be made live again. Otherwise, the provider is going to get a data lock there.
Okay, I think the next question that came in was also about pausing, so I'll skip over that one. Then if we look at what if an employer stops their apprenticeship service connection to on the incorrect date? Have we covered that one as well? So stopping okay.
They do get the option if they stop a record with a particular date, they do get the option to modify that stop date.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
But
Thank you.
But they can't remove it, obviously.
Okay. Thanks, Sam. Question for you, if I can. What can you not force from an update from? Start that again. What can you not force an update from the? I think that's why. Why can you not force an update from the ILR to the apprenticeship service when a break in learning is requested?
Yeah, so I read it as why as well, and thank you for the feedback. So there's been a couple of questions saying something similar to say why can't it just be automated, or why can't it just be forced straight across? The service is built and designed to be like an employer-led service, and hence the pause and stop options being available to the employers. As Henry's touched on before, if there is a break in learning, there doesn't have to be a pause on the employer side, but we give them the functionality and the control for them to use. The ILR submissions from providers are used to drive the payments. So as long as the data is matching between the ILR and the service, then the payments will sort of go through. It's certainly some feedback that's been mentioned in this call, so we'll take that away to look at potentially sort of maybe almost having some auto kind of pause around breaks and learning. So we'll take that feedback away and put it towards our payments improvement plans that we've got going on.
Okay, excellent, thank you. And Henry, if I can ask you this next question. So where an employer stops a record in AS, but we're still returning a live record in the ILR, will we still receive payments? The stop will create a DLOC error, which I thought meant for payments that would cease to the provider.
Yeah, I mean, that's correct. If a record is stopped with a stop date that clashes with your live record in the ILR, so say the stop date is October 2023 and 2022, and the learner is live after that date, it will block your payments, yes.
Okay.
That's the answer to that one, yes.
Okay, thanks. Sam, I know this is a similar question to one we've asked before. Tell me if it is. This is about training providers having functionality to send price changes to employer without having to force a DLOC.
It's quite similar, but unfortunately, no. Both the ILR and the service are they're separate services and systems, but then obviously they do come together to sort of data match to see if there's a price change or course change or anything like this. So if a price change is needed, then it would have to be triggered by changing the ILR, and then that would trigger a notification for the employer to go and approve. Again, it's a control and a security mechanism for the employer. So I'm not saying you would all do this, but as a provider, you didn't just throw in an extra £10,000 and the employer wouldn't have any idea of it. It's ultimately their funds available to spend on apprenticeships, and so they have the control measures of a stop and a pause and approving the DLOCs.
Okay, cool, thank you. And then I'll skip a couple of questions and then go to there's a question about the example about the breaking learning that was given. Because the pause has been applied prior to April, the April payment actually being received, it would actually prevent the provider receiving the payment. Is there anything being done to rectify this? Sean, I think that was for you.
Can we come back to that one, Nick? Maybe provide a response when we go through the unanswered ones later on that one.
Yeah, of course we can. Yeah, that's fine. So what we'll do, as I mentioned earlier on, any of the questions, and there are going to be lots of them that we don't get around to answering in today's session, we'll commit to providing some responses, and then we'll send them out to everybody that attended today's session. So yeah, we can do that by all means. Right, so I didn't hear mention of a TNP 5 or 6 during the presentation. But there's a question that says, if a learner changes employer more than once, do you use TNP 3 and 4 again, or is there a TNP 5 or 6?
Yeah,
Henry?
you use TNP 3 and 4 again. There is no 5 and 6. We have 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Okay, I didn't hear reference to that, but I thought that was worth clarifying. And then Sean, why do you need a funding adjustment figure for the learning aim after return from a break?
So essentially, if they're returning with an employer that's different to they went on the break in learning, then the provider would need to record that remaining cost.
Okay. And then let's look at the time and skip a few of the questions for some of the scenarios. So the first scenario, there was Henry. There's a question about the first scenario that was that Sean detailed. Wouldn't that make an error because the end date is now different from what's in the Apprenticeship Service?
So the first scenario was just a normal break in learning. No, it wouldn't make an error. In the first scenario, you record a break in learning as outlined, and the Apprenticeship Service isn't touched. It won't create an error. No.
Okay, and then I'm going to skip through. There's a question about scenario 2. So for scenario 2, the return from a bill with the first COA, what was the original TNP 1 and 2 from the first learning aim, and would that need to be copied to the new learning aim on the ILR, or can this now just show as TNP 3 and 4 for the change of employer? I think that's Sean, that's a question for you.
Sorry, can you just repeat that one for me?
Yeah, this related to scenario 2, and apologies, I've scrolled down a couple of questions to try and cover some of the scenarios that you've looked at. So it says for scenario 2, the return from bill with a first COA, would the original TNP 1 and 2 from the first learning aim need to be copied to the new learning aim on the ILR, or can this just show the TNP 3 or 4 for the change of employer?
So if they're returning with the same employer that they were with when they went on that break in learning, we take the TNP 1 and TNP 2 that were in that original learning aim and replicate them in the new learning aim, same employer. If they are returning from that break in learning with a new employer, then we must record the remaining cost that's been agreed with that new employer, and that would be in a TNP 3 and TNP 4.
Okay, thank you. Duncan, we've got a question for you. What happens if the apprentice has moved employers so many times that the residual price is less than what they could have been, what could have been the completion payment?
Sure. So effectively, with the negotiated prices, you always need to record the price that is real to you as according to the rules. And what would happen is that we would keep paying up until we get to the funding band max. Now with TNP 3 and 4, you can have some residual completion payments, i.e. You can end up drawing down more of the proportion of the funding via the program funding, just based on the fact that you've got a 20% of the final part of learning with a new employer that is classed as a completion payment. It is possible that you could get a price change that means that you end up having more price being drawn down than you have completion payment left, and in that within the funding band max. And in that case, you get paid the proportion of your completion payment up to the funding band max, and the rest would be unfunded by the SFA. But you could source that from your employer as additional payment from them. I hope that helps.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And I think I'm going to make this the last question, and I know we've got many more that we haven't got to yet, so apologies for that. But the last question that I've got is that there's one, Sean, that there's a difference between what the provider's been advised by the support by the service desk. So it said several times the service desk has said that if somebody's already on break in learning and happens to change employer whilst on break, then the original learning aim should change from 6 temporarily withdrawn to 3 withdrawn, and they'd be recorded as a restart without an agreed break in learning, and that this is based on the fact that the agreed break in learning was with their former employer and now not the new one. Is that correct?
I think this one sounds quite technical, Nick, and it's obviously relating to some advice that the service desk are giving out. Can we pick this one up afterwards as well?
Yeah, of course we can, because we've got quite a few questions to come back with responses. So yeah, so we'll do that. We'll get responses to that one and the other questions that have been answered, and we'll send them around within sort of 4 or 5 weeks following the end of today. Okay. Listen, I think. Thank you everybody for submitting questions. Thank you guys for responding to those questions. And sorry that the time has marched on and we've not been able to get through all of them. We could have probably done another half an hour or so in this session just to deal with all the questions. So if we can move on to the next couple of slides, that'd be good. So I just wanted to let you know about some of the other technical webinars that we've got coming up in the next few months. Lots of you have registered already, which is great. There's still some space on those webinars, so please forward the registration details to other individuals in your organisations that you think might benefit from those webinars. So we've got a session on DLOCs coming up on the 14th of September, understanding your payment reports, that is on the 5th of October, and then finally we've got a session on recording a grade and certification at the end of November, on the 30th of November. And we're including endpoint assessment organisations in that audience as well. So they're live. Go and register now if you haven't done it. We do sort of tend to sell out of some of our webinars, so please go and reserve your place quickly. Now, all of the sessions will be recorded and they'll be available after the live events directly from the webinar link that we will show on screen, and also on the YouTube channel as well. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. I've got it, yeah, okay. So as always, just talk to you about the fact that our YouTube channel is currently on the Department for Education YouTube channel at Education.gov UK, and we've got 3 playlists on that channel, one of which is for Apprenticeship Service webinar recordings like today. There's support videos on using the Apprenticeship Service, and that shows different functions of the Apprenticeship Service. And there's also then the Apprenticeship Support Videos playlist, which is created to support the delivery, or for videos created to support the delivery of apprenticeships. We will be moving our YouTube channel again in the very near future. The DFE channel is having a bit of a restructure. So in the next 3 or 4 weeks probably we'll move over to @DFE Sector Comms, so you'll see us there, but we'll let you know how that goes at the next webinar. Can I move on to the next slide, please? Okay, so on this slide, this is our final slide, a few links for where you can go for support. There's a PDF document of the slides in the control panel under handouts, so you can go and access that now. And there's also a second PDF in there which just shows some of the links that are on the slide for you as well. So there should be two documents in there for today. So obviously from the slide that we've got here, if you haven't seen apprenticeships.gov.uk already, go and have a look at that. It's a really great site. And obviously you will all be hopefully aware of the ESFA Communities site, which is the peer-led discussion forum for providers to help go through some of the issues for some of the problems around breaks in learning and TNPs. And I know you provide lots of good peer support to each other on that site, so please do check that out if you haven't done already. Registering for future webinars, there's the link on the screen, which will also be in the handout. And by the beginning of next week, you'll be able to access a recording of today's webinar from that link as well. And that recording will be available from that link until the end of this series of technical webinars, so the end of November. And as I said, we'll also put a copy of it onto that YouTube channel as well. And then finally, if you've got any queries about the apprenticeship service in general, go to the self-service support tool, or you can email the support desk as well, and the contact details for that are on the slide and in the handout. So I'm 3 minutes over. Apologies for the overrun. We're at the end of the session now. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to the presenters for going through that. It was an amazing trawl through such a technical subject. And please remember, as you leave, you'll be directed to that short survey. Just drop your thoughts in there. Let's have some feedback. That'd be great. So that's it. We're at the end. Bye, everybody, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.